So hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this opening session of UN Behavioral Science Week 2024 on the topic of embedding behavioral science into the UN. So my name is Mary McLennan. I'll be moderating today's session. I'm also the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary-General, and I lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I'll come to shortly. So before we get into the content of today's session, what I wanted to do was to speak a little bit about Behavioral Science Week. And now this is the 6th Behavioral Science Week that we've been convening and hosting UN entities. This year, we bring together 38 UN entities, so quite a lot of interest and demand when it comes to behavioral science, especially in communicating thoughts and reflections on behavioral science throughout the week. So there's lots to explore. Here's just a little bit about the agenda. There's more to unpack in the descriptions, but you'll see we have sessions ranging in topics from health to climate to the informal-formal divide, sustainability, etc. So please feel free to check out the agenda and attend the sessions throughout the week. Everything is free and open to everyone in and outside the UN. You're welcome to join our conversations and participate in discussions with our panelists. Okay, so with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and go into the content of today's session. So we'll have 3 portions of today's event. So the first section will be about the bigger picture, behavioral science across the UN, particularly when it comes to the efforts of the Secretary-General's office. Secondly, we'll speak to a behavioral scientist who has experience working and applying behavioral science with member states as well as with international organizations to hear about some reflections on how to embed behavioral science from that perspective. And then finally, we'll hear from a panel of colleagues from across the UN and their reflections on thinking about embedding behavioral science into their entities. And at the very end, I'll then conclude with a few comments and reflections on how you can engage with behavioral science across the UN throughout the week as well as beyond. Okay, so with that, I'd like to kick it off with some remarks from the Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed. So unfortunately, given her schedule, she's not able to be with us today and to share a video with us, but she has done that and she will share it with us shortly. So we encourage you to check out our social media channels and the sessions over the upcoming days where we'll share the video from the DSG. What we thought we'd do was to share some reflections that she spoke about recently regarding UN 2.0 more broadly, and I'll let her explain what that is, as well as behavioral science within this UN 2.0 idea. So with that, over to the DSG.
When we first thought about all the components of our common agenda, what was really important to us is at the center of this are the people of the UN. And so for us, UN 2.0 is our response to how we will pivot and meet the world where it's at and where it needs to go with our staff, and thinking about what that means for investing in our staff, but attending to many of the quintet of change issues that you hear about. So the behavioral science that needs to go into this, because we really do have to change the way we are wired and think about the responses and the support we give. But it's also about innovation. It's about data. It's about the digital part of the work that we do. And it allows everyone to think about these and how they interrelate. It's about strategic foresight. There is no way that we cannot be thinking into the future when, in fact, a lot of what we do today affects that. And I think there's more acknowledgement of that. Things are very different. The crises and the complexities that we're dealing with today are not what we were designed for. So while we're attending to some of those structural issues, the most important asset is us and how we do this and the tools that we're given to make that so. So I hope what it will do is make us more fit for purpose, that we can actually get out there and raise the ambitions and be more responsive for the needs. And,
Great, thank you for those remarks from the Deputy Secretary-General. So there's a lot here to unpack further about what UN 2.0 is and what it could mean across the UN. So with that, I'd like to turn it over now to Ayaka Suzuki, who's the Director of the Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit within the Executive Office of the Secretary-General. Just as some context here, she's also previously been the Chief of Staff in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and the Department of Field Support, and she brings to our discussion today a varied career of leading roles in field settings, including Libya and Haiti as well. So with that, Ayaka, over to you in your role within the Secretary-General's office, reflecting on behavioral science within UN 2.0. So from your perspective, why does the UN need UN 2.0 today?
Thank you, Mary. Very delighted to join you today, and welcome to all the colleagues tuning in. And welcome to Behavioral Science Week. Why is UN 2.0 important? I think the Deputy Secretary-General said it very eloquently. I mean, she's always so articulate. It's not, UN 2.0 is not an end to itself. It really is a means for us to better serve the people, better deliver on our mandates. You may recall that back in September 2023, the Secretary General issued the final one of his series of policy briefs that came out of our common agenda process that you referenced. It's right here, and it's available widely. If you haven't read it already, please download it from our common agenda website. We also have a dedicated UN 2.0 website as well. But basically, as the DHG said, UN 2.0 skills are data, digital, strategic foresight, behavioral science, and innovation. Even though innovation is not a skill, it's really more doing things differently. But we believe that these skills are absolutely essential. These modern skills are essential for us to be better fit for purpose to meet the challenges that we face today and tomorrow.
Great, thanks for that, Ayaka. So now you mentioned the 5 areas of the quintet. So maybe just unpacking that a bit further with you, and how is the UN actually working to increase and embed these areas of work across the UN to realize this ambitious agenda that you put out for changing the way the UN operates?
Yeah, so in the policy brief of UN 2.0, we identify several action drivers, and if I remember correctly, So we believe that leadership is absolutely essential. And I think that those of you who are BeSci specialists too, you know that leaders modeling behavior is the most key to anything, any transformation agenda. We also have culture as a big piece of that. Also community. We now have communities of practice for all 5 areas of the quintet, as you mentioned, and obviously, innovation and behavioral science were the vanguards of this. You guys even had communities of practice even before we came up with the notion of this quintet of change, UN 2.0 skills. There's also just programs that offerings that we are now beginning to incorporate these skills, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, there's just so much that's happening already, and we're trying to now systematize some of these changes. So there was a meeting of the executive committee recently where they endorsed the approach, kind of a 3-tiered approach moving forward. One is a development of a joint action plan, which basically is an effort to kind of pull our resources together and then identify things that the UN system as a whole can do together. And we're working very closely with UN system focal points to develop this action plan. We're also developing a roadmap for the Secretariat, which the Executive Committee will endorse. And then there will be a starter kit that we're calling starter kit that will be made available to everybody so that different agencies can also incorporate and adopt them as they formulate their new strategic plans, for example, or any other strategies. And the key thing also here is that we're really, and this is also part of 10 drivers of change, we're really encouraging kind of a use case driven, problem driven approach. And to that end, and this is part of our action plan as well, that we're really focusing on kind of lighthouse project, catalytic projects that could also show colleagues what is possible. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ayaka, for those remarks. And I'm sure many of the longstanding members of the behavioral science group are with us today. I appreciate the comments you made about the group and the importance of the community to bring people together, and the weeks and all of the things that we've done over the years. So thank you for that acknowledgement. And yes, there's a lot of growing work across the UN. You know, entities like UNICEF, the World Bank, UNDP, and others have initiatives that are focused on behavioral science. So really kind of propelling what you're saying, what you've been speaking to. And yes, and really interesting to hear about what's to come for UN 2.0 and behavioral science. We'll be looking out for that. So just maybe to conclude here, if you have a few final remarks about your sentiment on where we're going, any kind of comments on just encouragement maybe throughout the week for colleagues working in behavioral science, any final remarks before before we let you go for today.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I really think that it's remarkable, first of all, that the community of practice for behavioral science is really growing and it's taking off. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have something like over 5,000 members already from 70 different UN offices, 140 countries. So it's really a global movement. But also, I think what's special about this group is that this also includes academia, civil society, and non-UN entities as well. It also helps facilitate, and especially this is an area where it's relatively new to the UN. It's important to interact constantly with academics and practitioners from outside the UN system, so we can learn much, we can continue to learn and to enhance our knowledge and practices. So, I mean, I think what we just have to understand is that it's a journey, right? We're not all going to become behavioral science specialists overnight. It is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And I keep saying, my colleagues and I keep saying to colleagues is that it's a gradual process. We have to be mindful about how we start to shift resources to incorporate these skill sets, training, hiring, also investing, right? But again, it's a journey. It's transformation is something that takes over time, but as long as we have a roadmap and we have goalposts, we can get there. So all of this to say that, people who are listening to this, I'm sure are really change agents in their own entities and really trying. And it's not always easy. There's so much resistance to change in a bureaucracy that we work in. So I would just say, don't be discouraged. And you have champions in EOSG. You heard from the Deputy-Secretary-General. Secretary-General also feels the same way. In fact, we're having a senior management meeting on this topic during the BeSci week. So, and I think that as the level of understanding increases among the senior leadership as well, I think that the approach will be embraced more systematically across the board. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this morning.
Oh, thank you for your remarks and for the encouragement and for the real conversation around behavioral science that you've spoken about, the real challenges that colleagues are facing as well as the successes too. So thank you for those, and looking forward to continuing the discussion throughout Behavioral Science Week. Thanks so much, Ayaka. Great. Okay, so with that, now following a further understanding about UN 2.0, I'd like to turn it over now to a video from the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Volker Türk. For those of you who aren't familiar with him, he was previously the Under-Secretary-General for Policy in the Executive Office of the Secretary-General, where he coordinated global policy work. Prior to this, he was the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection in the Office of UNHCR in Geneva. So he has, again, a varied career and knowledge of the UN at senior levels, and he'll speak to some of the work that his entity, OHCHR, is doing regarding behavioral science. So with that, over to the video.
Colleagues, distinguished participants, the people I have spoken to from across the world in my time as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights have expressed a deep desire for human rights to be respected and protected. Incorporating behavioral science into our human rights work is not merely an academic exercise, it's a pragmatic step to making tangible improvements in people's lives. With its nuanced understanding of human actions and motivations, behavioral science holds tremendous potential to address some of the most entrenched challenges we face by unpacking the cognitive biases that lead to prejudice. We can design interventions and responses that promote empathy, respect, and equality. By improving our awareness of human behavior and decision-making, we can strengthen our outreach to those calling for a seat at the table, including young people and others. And by identifying the behavioral barriers that prevent marginalized groups from accessing their rights, we can develop more effective and equitable policies. So it's really about mindfulness in all that we do. My office is in its early stages of bringing behavioral science to scale, in collaboration with the UN Behavioural Science Group. But we're already using some of the lessons of behavioral science in Asia and the Pacific, for example, where it is informing our efforts to change narratives on migration and to counter discrimination and to reinforce human dignity and rights. Internally, my office is also launching a behavioral science initiative for an environmentally sustainable office to help colleagues learn about our digital carbon footprint and its impact on our environment. Dear colleagues, building on the excellent work being done by UN practitioners in this emerging area of behavioral science, we look forward to embracing this interdisciplinary approach. Rather than react, we can respond proactively and preventatively. We can tap into what unites us rather than what divides us. Together we can build a future where human rights are for all, everywhere. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for those remarks from the High Commissioner about how behavioral science can be used by specific entities. There's a lot to unpack there, and hopefully we can hear more about the work of OHCHR this week. There's a session on sustainability that is essentially the initiative that the High Commissioner referenced in his remarks. If you want to know more about that, I encourage you to check out that session. But as Ayaka mentioned as well, hopefully there will be more senior leaders speaking about the importance of behavioral science and the work that we do in the future, and we can have further discussions at this level as well. Okay, so with that, on to the second portion of today's session. As I mentioned, we'll be hearing from a behavioral scientist who's working not only to apply behavioral science in practical settings, but also with member states and international organizations. So hear from her remarks. So next, I'd like to call Professor Ana Balsa. She's professor of economics at the Universidad de Montevideo. She applies behavioral science when it comes to the economics of human capital, health, and education, so areas that are very important to the work of the UN and the SDGs. She's been working with the government of Uruguay since 2017 and collaborates with different organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank and others. So thank you very much for joining us, Professor Balsa. Great that you're here today. My first question for you, thank you. My first question for you is, what impact do you think could be achieved through increased application of behavioral science in the UN? I know some of your work is focused on early childhood aspects. Any kind of insights about behavioral science more technically would be great. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for having me here in this session. Well, in our work, we have combined information technology, artificial intelligence, and behavioral sciences with the purpose of promoting healthy pregnancies and positive parenting among vulnerable families in Uruguay. So our final aim is to improve child development and also to improve family well-being. In terms of technology, we have reached this has allowed us to reach out better to families and to target our interventions better. And in terms of behavioral sciences, well, it has provided us with tools to make the information more available, more attractive, more assimilable to families, and also to facilitate taking this information to action. We have identified three main biases that parents have when they have to interact with their children and stimulate their children. And these are present bias, so the tendency we have to postpone actions that are costly in the present but will give us rewards in the future. For example, reading every day to our children. Another bias is cognitive inattention. We have which is like the inability to focus and make good decisions due to the presence of multiple other distractors, especially in families that are poor and that face financial burdens, violence, and other critical issues. And the third bias is negative identities. We have identified that many parents have a low sense of self-efficacy with their parenting skills. And so we have tried to design interventions that address mainly these three biases by reminding them about the benefits of their actions, their current and future benefits of their actions, by also trying to simplify actions to give them triggers or things to jumpstart their actions. And also we talk a lot in our interventions about self-care and the importance of own resources and the resources that we have in the community to strengthen the parenting skills. And using these these interventions, we have found that the combination of technology and behavioral design has allowed us to improve parental engagement with our children in stimulating activities, to decrease parental stress, to improve the language interactions between families, between mothers or fathers and their child, and also to help these vulnerable populations connect to government services. These are cheap interventions that need really to be adapted to local needs and resources in order to work.
Great, thank you for that example of how we can apply behavioral science, so noting some of the biases that we reflect upon across different domains of the work of the UN. So thank you for that. We can hopefully unpack more of your work in another session to hear more about your results and exactly how you did your experiments. I'm curious. But for now, given the theme of today's session, which is about embedding behavioral science into the UN and into our work with member states. So you mentioned, you worked with governments in Uruguay and other partners as well. What lessons from your work with governments in the UN do you think we could leverage in the UN with our own thinking about embedding behavioral science into our organization, but also in our work with member states? You know, as you mentioned, we work with governments as well. So just generally your thoughts on how to embed behavioral science in organizations, given your work as a behavioral scientist now going into practice. What insights do you have to share?
Yeah. So first, I think that my first recommendation is to have government workers take possession of the intervention. If they don't take possession, if they don't take ownership of it, the intervention won't work. So for that, you need to involve them from the initial stages of the design, receive their insights, their experience. They do have experience in the field, so you have to take it and really combine it with your ideas, your more theoretical ideas as a researcher. The second is that there is resistance to change, a lot of resistance to change in government. There is a lot of inertia, status quo bias. So those are the barriers you have to really work also. Not only the think about biases in terms of the population you are trying to target, but also in terms of the workers you will be dealing with. And inertia is a very strong bias. So you have to try to think about low-cost solutions, to try to think about defaults to make them sort out these biases. And related to this, the rhythms of change are much slower in the government, so you have to be patient. Sometimes the rhythms are very different from what you're accustomed to, and you have to be patient and accept that there are certain processes that have to be done in the government because they provide guarantees of that things are being transparent and that they are pursuing certain targets. The third one is that it is not only about design. Implementation is a big component of success. So you have to really shift from thinking about a project to really learning how to implement it. You have to be a manager. You have to learn how to deal with human resources. You have to learn how to solve many problems that come in the way, articulate, negotiate, and probably the final project you end up implementing is very different from the initial project that you design. And the fourth is try to convince politicians of the importance of evidence-based policy, of innovation, of the importance of evaluating programs. This is not easy, and you have to be a good communication. You have to be a good negotiator. Be ready to spend time to articulate, and sometimes not to be deceived by things that maybe you see on TV, that there's an announcement that you never discussed, and you have to know that these things happen, but really be very convincing and try to translate something into something that politicians can understand. So I think that those are my basic recommendations regarding working with government.
Great, thank you, Professor Balsa. I think this really outlines a lot of this echoes a lot of what we're hearing across the UN too, and working with different organizations, and the importance of, yes, there's a technical behavioral science, but then it's very different in practice when you start to work with policy questions and in big organizations and what that can turn into. And I think your point about, what you originally designed and what you ultimately end up implementing can be very different. I think that's common to pretty much every project that I worked on in behavioral science and practice. Just being open and flexible, I think, is one key thing that I very much agree with you as well. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Balsa, for joining us and for sharing your remarks.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
for sharing your more technical understanding. Now on to the final portion of today's session. So now we have a panel of UN colleagues at a senior level who will share some of their experiences reflecting on behavioral science and new ways of working generally in the UN and how we can embed that. So I'll just introduce them all now in alphabetical order. So first we'll hear from Sarah Hendricks, who's the Director Policy Program and Intergovernmental Division at UN Women. She's previously been the Director of Gender Equality, Global Growth and Opportunity at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the Director of Gender Equality and Social Inclusion at Plan International Headquarters. So she's well placed to be with us today to speak about program and policy work when it comes to gender equality in particular. And next we'll hear from Azonio Ogiello, who's the UN Resident Coordinator in Rwanda. He most recently served as the resident coordinator in Kyrgyzstan and has held other roles, including the resident representative of UNDP and UNFPA to the Kyrgyz Republic. Prior to this, in working in the UN, he was an attorney, university teacher, journalist, advised truth and justice and reconciliation, as well as human rights in commissions in Ghana, Liberia, Malawi, Namibia, and Sierra Leone. So again, very, very diverse experience to bring to our discussion today about how do we embed new ways of thinking and working in the UN. And then finally, we'll hear from Jyotsna Puri, also known as Jo Puri by many of her colleagues. She's the Associate Vice President for Strategy and Knowledge in the Knowledge Department at IFAD. So in this work, Jo leads strategy in key areas like agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion. So many spaces where behavior is incredibly important. Previously, she's been at the Green Climate Fund, 3IE, UNEP, the World Bank, and UNDP. And importantly, maybe for Jo's background, she's also an academic, and she's a technical background in behavioral science and more generally in academia. She's published many journals, so hopefully she can comment on some of the technical components too of our work overall. So with this, first, my first question is to Sarah. If you'd like to turn on your camera, I'll ask you a question. Great, thanks for joining us. So UN Women has explored the application of behavioral science for the last number of years. And some work recently was on digital violence against women and girls and a few others important areas. Which broadly, how can the organization work to embed behavioral science with a view to the quintet across the 5 areas of innovation as well? How can we embed behavioral science into your work, particularly given your experience in gender and social norms? How can UN Women reflect upon bringing behavioral science into its work overall? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mary, and thanks indeed for this opportunity to discuss this important topic. I'm really honored to be part of this esteemed panel. Especially as we think at UN Women about how we integrate behavioral science and more broadly behavioral change to really transform our work on gender equality. As you know, our mission at UN Women is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls in all their diversity and to accelerate progress on women's rights worldwide. And as such, with such a large mission, we constantly and consistently face barriers, including embedded gender and social norms, behaviors, and attitudes that fundamentally perpetuate gender-based discrimination, perpetuate inequalities. So changing these norms is really, Mary, at the heart of our work. Promoting positive social norms, including engaging men and boys, is actually one of 7 systemic outcomes in our strategic plan. So how do we go about this? What are we learning as we go? We are employing various strategies and approaches, including rigorous research, but also bringing in behavioral science, social norm change into programming, into measurement, into partnerships, particularly with grassroots women's organizations to foster the type of change that we collectively envisage. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In Nepal, we work through an innovative mix of data collection and measurement, but also storytelling, and coupled with the provision of essential services and peer support mechanisms to try to drive changes in gender roles and relations, but also in attitudinal change and in behavioral change. And this particular effort, which has a strong evaluative component, is reaping some very important insights. Another example globally is that we convene something called the Unstereotype Alliance. The Unstereotype Alliance brings together the private sector advertising industry leaders and decision makers to look at how to more systematically eliminate harmful stereotypes in marketing and in private sector advertising, which then in turn can actually shape behaviors. So we're learning a lot as we go. I'd say we're still kind of in an early trajectory in this work. We've gleaned some valuable insights that are applicable to the application of behavioral science, behavioral change across UN Women, but also I think across the quintet of change in the UN more broadly. So 3 insights come to mind. First is about context, and that context really is paramount. In the Nepal example that I mentioned earlier, we found that really multiple and very interconnected factors, such as the strength of religious institutions, the resources materially that communities have, economic factors like the distribution of agricultural land, all of this shapes social norms and the drivers of human behavior. Therefore, our intent and engagement at the community level to make changes should be part of an overall package of interventions. Here, I think caution is also needed. An intervention in one community to impact a social norm or gender norm change may actually not necessarily yield the same results to changing gender norms in a neighboring community. And so those differential contextual factors are really important to pay attention to. That leads to my second point, which is just about the importance of partnerships. Of course, we know, and I'm humbled to be here with so many giants in this field. So many organizations have been working on behavioral science for years and years and decades and decades. And as the evidence base grows, we really should form partnerships with organizations to test, to implement successful solutions, to do so at greater scale that can then facilitate transformational change on gender equality and on women's rights. Universities, academia, think tanks are great examples. They're not the only ones. Communities and civil society organizations also have such a wealth of critical, contextual, and practical-based knowledge that is really indispensable for change. And so they need to be supported too in these efforts and across the UN's quintet of change. And lastly, as I close, just to emphasize that we've seen in many of our projects in our field of work that can do some harm and even sometimes more harm than good because they didn't consider gender equality from the outset. So as the UN system increasingly implements behavioral science projects, let us guard against this. Let us be thoughtful. Let us be intentional. For instance, the UN system could mandate and establish clear criteria for the inclusion of gender equality considerations in all initiatives that actually aim at achieving behavioral change or incorporating behavioral science approaches. Conversely, projects that are aimed at achieving gender equality actually need to consider any relevant behavioral change dimensions. So it sort of goes both ways in terms of that caution and intentionality. These are just a few ideas, hopefully, Mary, to kick off our conversation today that can help us maximize the benefits of behavioral science in terms of driving changes in addressing embedded discrimination and inequalities. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for those insightful remarks. I think this is a whole part about another discussion to be had. I think your point about research and really just embedding some of those methods when it comes to thinking and principles from behavioral science and into the work that we do in the UN is a fundamental component of how we've defined behavioral science. So thank you for bringing that up. And then your points on context as well. And that's fundamental to how we reflect upon this. And I know UN Women has been doing this for many years when it comes to social norms already, whether it's called behavioral science or not. So really interesting insights there. And also partnerships. Yes, exactly. This is what we've been doing in behavioral, what we're trying to do. So maybe we can have further conversation after this about how we can really take those recommendations for us applying behavioral science forward as well. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Okay, so next on to our second panelist, Zonia. My question for you is, so as mentioned, you're the resident coordinator in Rwanda. So in Rwanda, the UN is exploring the application of innovation more broadly, which we can maybe has implications for behavioral science. So my question for you is, how might we leverage lessons from embedding innovation when now we reflect upon behavioral science, particularly at the country level, which is where you have quite a bit of experience. So over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. First of all, behavioral science applications is some innovative way of doing things differently. So actually, they fit in perfectly well. And I'd like to speak to 6 legs of my intervention. The first is by way of introduction, is that we have been engaged in a 2-year effort at the UN country team in Rwanda to change mindsets, change thinking, and change approaches to be able to offer a stronger value proposition for what the UN brings through our Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework to meet the aspirations of UN 2.0. And I think the Deputy Secretary-General highlighted why this is not a nice to have. This is not a must to have approach for how the UN system works broadly. The second leg is then about the recognition of the context, which we're all aware. Significant decrease in resources to the UN for many reasons, COVID-1 Ukraine, but also many of typical donors are themselves grappling with the socioeconomic impact of conflict in their own countries. And increasingly, many of them are preferring to make direct transfers to the national budgets, which is a good thing because it's in line with the Paris Agreement on aid effectiveness. But also many are using private sector institutions like accounting firms now for development implementation because they think they offer better speed and greater effectiveness than the UN system. A number of our partners see the UN as ponderous, bureaucratic, overly focused on pilots, and therefore not achieving scale and the impact. So, and some governments have actually been critical of the UN as engaged in navel gazing and wanting more of our own projects than the national development priorities. And regrettably, many heads of agencies at the country level still continue to be assessed in terms of their performance by how much money they've raised for their own specific agencies, for how they fly the agency flag, rather than how we work together as a system. So the third issue then is what then was our goal in doing this? And our goal is simple: a well-articulated value proposition of the UN system that demonstrates that it can work in a coherent, integrated way and at scale, and therefore a clearly defined strategic and collective offer by the UN, leveraging all the assets of the UN in support of the national development priorities. And then a deliberate effort on partnerships that allows us to use OPM, other people's money, OPM, to realize our intended results even when we don't have the resources. So number 4, what then did we do specifically? Well, first, we used the evidence. There was a German Development Institute report in early 2002 that assessed the first generation of UN cooperation frameworks since the start of the reforms on 1st January 2019. And that report was clear that while the new generation of cooperation frameworks are better articulated, better written, stronger narratives, they actually do not offer much in terms of the old generation of cooperation frameworks, because if I use my own words, they still represent a salad. It's a mix, potpourri of everything, almost like the lowest common denominator to get every agency happy. And therefore, they were calling for really stronger efforts in defining what is UN collective and strategic effort at the country level to meet the needs of member states, all of whom are struggling to realize all the targets and indicators in the SDGs. The second thing we did was my team then analyzed the evaluation reports of the major UN agencies at the country level, the 5 biggest ones. We took all the evaluation reports and we found similarities in all of them, how they work in siloed approaches, not integrated, how they focus on pilots rather than strategic issues, how they were challenged in working at scale, how they failed to work with private sector, and many things about the inability of the UN to pitch at the level the member states were expecting. And then the third thing we did was we commissioned sample surveys, UN staff, civil society, development partners, government partners. And it was simple. What do they see as UN's comparative advantage in the country? And Mary, the report was sobering. Everybody thought the UN could do a lot more in terms of convening, 80-something%, but the actual convening, 41%. We have technical expertise, but deploying the technical expertise was weak. Direct results from implementation, extremely weak. So you read all of that report, the positive spin I put on those sample surveys, that there's an opportunity gap. an opportunity gap that the UN needs to meet in terms of our aspirations or where we think we are, and where those with whom we interlocute, but importantly, where our own staff, who are the ones in the front line of delivery, think we are. There's a lot of work to do. So all of this allowed me to present to our UN country team a vision statement, collective visioning process of where we want to go, but what we would do intentionally and specifically, overcoming agency barriers, overcoming agency ways of working, overcoming agency attitudes to realize the UN we want to see happen. And then last, second to last, how did we do it? Because you talk about changing behaviors, isn't it? Changing mindsets. So with support of DCO, the Presencing Institute of New York University organized for us late in 2022 an SDG Leadership Lab. How do you generate integral thinking? How do you generate a systemic approach? People get appointed as heads of agencies for many reasons, but it's not always for ability to think integrally or systemically. So this visioning together of what is integral thinking, what is a systemic approach, what are the goals we want to meet collectively, and they're working backwards from there to the specific agency programs and projects was very useful. And over the last 3 years, we have used our annual retreats, 2022, 2023, and 2024, which took place last week, as platforms for affirmation of this direction of travel, platforms for reporting on progress, but also identifying challenges. So we needed to reassure ourselves that we're on this track together. And this was all the more important because there's significant mobility in the UN system. The heads of agencies with whom I created the vision in 2022, 2/3 of them have left. We have new heads of agencies. So how do you reaffirm this vision that everybody shares them together? The third was that we use our common country assessment, which is an analysis of the country context, to create a common understanding of the UN value proposition, the new pathways. If these are the problems, what is it that the UN needs to do differently to help address the problems? And then the fourth was we went out of our way to organize dedicated conversations at the country team level, heads of agencies level, on big ticket items on which we needed to seek consensus. One of the latest was the 6 transitions that we adopted at the political summit, political declaration last year. How do you embed those 6 transitions in the work you do at the country level? But as a basis of these conversations, we agreed on 3 transitions: food systems, education, and then the third one was on social protection and jobs as our entry point for using the 5 Ps of the SDGs the way we go. The other 3 transitions on digitalization, on climate change and adaptation, on energy use and energy affordability, we decided we're going to mainstream them as a way to drive this challenge. And then finally, in terms of how we did it was, rather, agencies will normally take the global strategies from the headquarters, which makes sense, and ground them in the country work. We reversed it. We said, let us look at what are the priorities that are emerging from the sector working group discussion between government and development partners. We have sector strategies. What are the main priorities? Now, from those priorities, you filter them, which are the ones aligned with our comparative advantage as a UN system that links to the strategic plans that agencies want to have. And that's how we ground our work. So we are working towards the same national priorities, but in a systemic way. And then finally, what are the initial results that have emerged? Well, we've come up with a very short and a very smart list of 7 priorities. In our current UNDAF, we have 6 outcomes and 27 outputs. If you're an evaluator, how will you evaluate 27 outputs about what the 2 UN agencies in a country bring together? So 7 key smart priorities we will implement over the next 5 years. And then we are filtering them further with a 5 set of prioritizations criteria. Number 1, are they achievable within the 5-year span of the cooperation framework? Number 2, can they deliver high-level results? Number 3, are they aligned with Rwanda's own vision goals? Number 4, do they reflect the contribution of more than one agency? And all of these based with 3 key criteria that will underline everything we do. Are they integrated and innovative? Are they coherent? And are they scalable? So now we are at the point now we were beginning to write the cooperation framework using these filters. And I feel fairly confident that by next year's behavioral science meeting week, I might report on progress on what we've done to achieve all these goals. Thank you very much, Mary.
Great. Thank you for those comments and reflections on what it's like to actually do this in practice at the country level. So lots there to unpack and some technical understanding for our colleagues as well might be interested. So I'll go to our final panelist here, but I just want to say I see some questions coming in, and we'll answer those throughout the week. So we won't be having a Q&A essentially in this session, but I will just maybe before we get to our last panelist say how we define behavioral science is an evidence-based understanding of how people actually behave, respond to policies, programs, and incentives in the real world. So we heard some remarks on this from Sarah, and also from our other panel from Anna Balsa as well. So we define behavioral science in kind of two components alongside that definition. So one is these principles and ideas, like Sarah mentioned social norms, Anna mentioned some of the biases as well. So leveraging some of these principles. And the second component is testing where possible. So we run experiments sometimes. We might do online or field experiments or just any kind of research component to understand what works. So hopefully that helps to bring some colleagues up to speed who maybe don't have the detailed background understanding just there. Okay, so but as I mentioned, there's lots to unpack throughout the week. So if you wanted to explore further what behavioral science means, there are many different examples and explanations that will be taking place. Okay, so now on to our final panelist, Jyotsna Puri. If you'd like to join us. That would be great. Thanks. Thank you, Joe. So my question to you is, IFAD has long applied behavioral science in its work. They've been one of the first members of the UN Behavioral Science Group many years ago, particularly in the innovation team. What do you see as the potential role for behavioral science in IFAD? And also, how can IFAD better embed behavioral science into its core work? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you very much for having me here and for really having IFAD in this discussion. If I might use the privilege of having the floor also to respond to, I think, the question that you were referring to, which is how do we define behavioral science? One of the key things that I think is very helpful for me when I'm speaking to people and talking about behavioral science is that behavioral science is the science of ensuring that people are getting to the outcomes that they truly want, and making it easy for them to get to the outcomes that they truly want. So removing, for example, some of the sludge in the system, but with small changes or tweaks, which are mostly non-monetary. And if they are monetary, then they are extremely small, so that they shouldn't really change the overall, calculation in your mind with respect to as to whether you should undertake the action or not. And I liked your addition of using scientific methods of testing, and that's exactly what we use as well. So in terms of the work that we do at IFAD, I really liked actually a mnemonic that was provided by the US Department of Health and Human Services, which is SIMPLER. And it's SIMPLER. S is for social influence, I is for implementation prompts, M is for mandated deadlines, P is for personalization, L is for loss aversion, E is for ease, and R is for reminders. And essentially what, and I think a few other institutions possibly use it, and if they don't, they should. But the nice thing about this overall mnemonic is also it gives us an understanding of what sort of behavioral science interventions it is useful to think about, even as we investigate as to what are the key reasons as to why people don't behave in the way that is most optimal for them, right? Which they do and which they do want to bring about. So there are quite a few examples of where we are trying to incorporate behavioral science and where we are making some inroads. I want to use a few examples if that's okay. So the first one I want to use is with respect to agroecology. So agroecology actually requires that we use cover crops, and that land essentially has cover crops, either the crops that we are either cultivating or cover crops. Now, the challenge with using cover crops for most farmers is that, of course, it does mean that there is some additional amount of effort that they have to make, and but cover crops can be extremely beneficial because it can help to reduce soil erosion, can provide weed control, can support pest management, and can reduce the overall need for fertilizer and herbicides. But the challenge is that with most other decisions that we have to take, that we tend to discount the future. And for most farmers, and especially because IFAD works with rural farmers, they tend to discount the future a whole lot more because of a whole host of reasons, right? So what does behavioral science teach us? Behavioral science teaches us that people tend to be risk averse about gains, but risk seeking about losses. And so really with an effort to shift the mental frame around cover cropping, for example, what we are trying to do and what the discussion also in the teams is about is really creating this overall narrative for farmers to understand the potential losses of not adopting cover crops, because we know that people tend to react to possible losses far more. So that's one example. The second example is recognizing that for many rural economies, actually traditional financial products aren't very suited to farmers, primarily because especially things like loans. And we know that loans get designed in ways where they're completely impervious or inured to the idea when most of the incomes are coming into farmers. So, and when this research was done and has been done by many others in academia, so Ideas 42 has looked at it, there are many papers that have been written on it. One of the key challenges is that loans need to be repaid at around the time when the money that has been brought forward by the harvest is actually exhausted. So this is one of the key things that we are trying to work on through conversations with farmers and loan officers, to really recognize that when farmers are most in possession of the income immediately after a harvest, then a simple mobile-based intervention that can help prompt farmers to better plan their loan requests and asset investments can really help. And then secondly, also to get financial institutions to think about getting loan repayments at the point of harvest, when farmers have most income. So that essentially speaks to the E part, making it easy, but also M part, which is having mandated deadlines, right? And having those prompts. So that's a second example. The third example is really about social influence and personalization, which is the S and the P part of the overall mnemonic. And this is with respect to gender equity. So gender action labs are areas that we've been using quite a bit. And this is essentially an instrument where men and women who have received education and seminars about why it is important to think about empowering women and to have far more intra-household equity, are then asked to also visualize what an equitable household would look like, right, together, and to build a vision around that. And that, along with also bringing in religious leaders and therefore getting social influences, has been quite successful. And we are hoping very much for it to continue to be successful. Two very quick examples is one of behavioral mindset, which is in Avanzar, which is a behavioral toolkit for IFAD projects that helps to create operational knowledge as well as instruments, but also provide innovative and low-cost solutions. This is being applied to increase women's participation in leadership workshops through self-affirmation activities, note-taking, and planning. And this is essentially, and then the last one, I think what I really want to emphasize also is how behavioral science is being used internally within the organization, both to reduce sexual harassment, but also to increase sexual exploitation and abuse reporting, but also to improve performance. And on sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse reporting, a lot of the initial work that was done by our support team, Abu Sarah, helped us to understand that the challenge was not being concerned about whether there's confidentiality or not. That has been dealt with through a ticketing system. And so we've introduced a lot of these changes as well internally in our system so that people feel far more confident. I'm going to stop here and turn it back to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jo, for all those examples. I think if we can share them with some of the colleagues later, they're always looking for really great case studies, and I don't think I've heard of some of these, so maybe we'll collect those. And just to say that your last point about sexual harassment, there's a session taking place on Friday that IFAD is actually leading on exactly this topic. So if you want to know more about that work in particular, I think UN Women as well, WFP as well as UNFPA will be there, excuse me, too. So there's lots to explore. I encourage you to check out that session. But thank you very much, Jo, for joining us and for your insights. As always, great to have you here. So with that, we're coming up to time. We've had so many insightful comments. I'm just going to maybe conclude with a few remarks about today's session and about the behavioral science group more broadly. So as mentioned at the start, throughout, there is the UN Behavioral Science Group. We aim to foster behavioral science across the UN and beyond. We've been hosting 5 Behavioral Science Week. This is the 6th one. We consist of over 5,000 members from over 70 UN entities and 150 countries, actually. And then we also have non-UN members from academia, civil society, NGOs, member states. So we'll put the link in the chat to join the UN Behavioral Science Group if you haven't done so already. There are lots of ways to engage with us throughout the year as well as in the next Behavioral Science Week. Next, I'd like to also point you towards some resources that exist. We have a number we've helped to lead over the number of years. So we have the UN Secretary-General's Guidance Note, the UN Behavioral Science Report, which features some of the work of UN Women, as well as IFAD and others, if you want to know more specifics. We also have a UN Practitioner's Guide to Getting Started, which leverages some of the frameworks that Jo mentioned, as well as others, really just tailored to the UN context, some thinking there. So we'll put those in the chat as well. And then I also wanted to mention today, we're actually launching the first edition of the UN Behavioral Science Review, which is on that resource link I just shared. This review essentially aims to bring together case studies, commentaries, and pieces to stimulate critical thinking, encourage cross-pollination, and contribute to global applications of behavioral science. This is really the first of its kind publication. It fills a void for colleagues both in and outside the UN, particularly in the Global South, to highlight outstanding practical work, as well as ideas, successes, challenges, and lessons learned. So I encourage you to check that out as well. I'd like to give a big thank you to Khushbu Katra, who is an editor with us on that document, to put a lot of time and effort into it as well. And there'll be opportunity to submit to the next edition if you check it out. So please read the report. And then finally here, my last comment as we close is we've also, we're seeking individuals who have made impactful contributions through research or application of behavioral science in and outside the UN in areas that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals and the mandates of the UN. So what we're doing here is essentially collecting individuals in what we're calling the UN Global Directory of Behavioral Science. So I encourage you to apply to that if you think you fit the bill and the criteria along those lines. Essentially, there will offer opportunities to engage with the UN, collaborate with the UN, participate in our discussions. Just check it out to know more. And then finally, of course, kicking off Behavioral Science Week, would need to include at the end here the link to the webinars and all the sessions in the agenda. So please join us for Behavioral Science Week. We have 5 days. In an hour, we have a session on data and cultivating a culture of data use within the UN, but there's much more to explore throughout the week. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you throughout the week. Thanks.